I'd like to talk about the impact of trauma on our 3 to 5-year-old children. First of all, one thing to remember is that the systems in the brain that get repeatedly activated will change and they become stronger. And then the systems that don't get activated become weaker and can potentially even disappear. So, just like a muscle, the more brain system, like, for example, the stress response in the case of trauma, gets exercised, the more it changes, and then the more risk there is of altered functioning that, could be detrimental for a child. And then, there is a famous brain scientist, Dr. Bruce Perry. What he says is that exposing a person to chronic fear and stress is like weakening the braking power of a car while adding a more powerful engine. You're changing the safety mechanisms that keep the car safe and from going out of control, but you're also increasing the power. So it can be a bit dangerous. And something to remember is that trauma can happen once or multiple times. The number and type of traumatic events that a child experiences is important. Reactions that a child has to trauma can vary by age, temperament. As a result, we can see a differential impact of kids who have experienced similar trauma. We see some gender differences. One thing that's important to know is sometimes we don't see the impact of early trauma until later, like in adolescence or even early adulthood. And so, really making sure that we deal with the trauma can be helpful for kids with their later functioning. And we know that cultural norms can impact kids' responses to trauma. One thing to think about with boys during the preschool years, they can be more emotionally reactive than girls. And so being able to provide that additional support to boys and regulating their emotions throughout this time period can be helpful. The right hemisphere of the brain, which is responsible for everything emotional, whether it's processing, regulation of emotions, or expressing emotions, it develops more slowly in boys, and then it can put them at risk for a longer period of time because if trauma is occurring to a child while that part of the brain is developing, there is the potential for damage to that part of the brain. Something else that can be important to think about are some of the signs of trauma that we see in preschool age kids, in that 3 to 5 age range. A child could have separation anxiety, become more clingy toward their primary caregivers, their parents. They could have regression in previously mastered behaviors like bedwetting, maybe just having accidents with toileting, and we might see language delays, kids who haven't used baby talk in months, years, may begin to regress backward. And we can see this in all different spheres of development. We also see that they might have a lack of developmental progress because they might not be progressing at the same level as their peers. They might try to recreate the traumatic event or events that have happened. They might talk about it, play it out, draw the event. They might have a hard time at nap time or bedtime. They might avoid sleep, have a hard time waking up. They might have nightmares. And, part of that could be because it's a separation, they don't feel safe. There could be other reasons as well. They could have more complaints like headaches, stomach aches, and even falling apart if they fall down and get just a minor bump or bruise. We might also see changes in behavior like their appetite, angry outbursts, not able to pay attention very well, and we might see withdrawal at times as well. We might also have more distress, like they're just really whiny, irritable, moody. They might be worried or afraid of new things. And, that's hard because kids during this age have fears about monsters or the dark or other things already. But this is a potential reaction to trauma as well for a child who's experienced a traumatic event. Then they might be worried about this traumatic event actually happening again. They might have new fears. They might start talking about death and dying. They might overreact to sensory stimulation, like not want loud noises, or they might underreact. They might not seek comfort or accept comfort from the ones they love most. We often see a loss of self-esteem or self-confidence. They might start to talk bad about themselves, like it's my fault. Part of that is because kids in the preschool age are pretty egocentric. They think that things that happen are caused by them. And so they might think that because they're bad, these terrible things have happened. There are some things that we might do to help kids heal. One is to help kids feel safe. Let them know, I'm here to keep you safe, and do whatever you can to make sure that they are safe. Make sure that there are predictable routines. And that doesn't mean having to do these certain things at certain times during the day, but more that the order in which they do things will be similar. Avoid trauma reminders. So if a child has experienced a terrible traumatic event around a campfire, then you might avoid having that child be at the campfire or at a campfire for a while until you're able to help the child get past it. If you are talking about the traumatic event, you want to talk about it with simple terms to help the child make sense of it and provide that reassurance of safety. And another thing you want to do is maybe ask the child what they're thinking about, because you might have gone 10 miles down further from what they're thinking about. And we just want to meet them where they are. And then we want to follow their lead in expressing their feelings during play. And we can normalize whatever feelings they're having, validate those feelings, and then talk about what we might be able to do about those feelings. We can use mindfulness, breathing exercises, and then also big muscle activities to help regulate kids' emotions and get some of that energy out around their big feelings. And, as part of this, we're teaching kids skills that they can do things to help themselves feel better. We can help the child verbalize their feelings. We might have to name them for the child in the beginning, particularly for those younger 3-year-olds, and say what you see in the child, and then check in with them about your accuracy, about whether or not you're naming the right feeling. Always remind the child that whatever traumatic event has happened is not their fault. Um, that's not their fault at all.